go there. That we ought not to have Martin Luther King's birthday, but it ought to be for another birthday.
No, that's nonsense.
Yeah, I don't want to hear that.
I appreciated his comments about black music.
Oh yeah, that's what I was trying to drive him back over to.
Yeah, some insight into that.
Yeah. He talked about Dr. Bradley,
Yeah, great gospel singer. Yeah.
And whatnot. And as long as you can sort of keep him over in that section and et cetera.
Then you're okay.
I thought he told me he wanted to talk about African American health. And then he came in and said that one of the real problems that we have is that Dr. Martin Luther King was part of the civil rights movement, and when he came to town, it created a lot of problems for a lot of folks, and et cetera.
Oh, so he didn't deal with the topic.
No.
I was thinking maybe the topic was.
Yeah, no, that's why we tried to, drove him back over in that area.
Yeah.
So we're going to call this Profiles in Courage of the African American Experience.
Yeah, Profiles in Courage in the
African American Experience, okay. And then you'll explain
what that means.
What you mean. Mm-hmm. Thank you and welcome to the show this morning. The topic this morning is Profiles in Courage in the African American Experience, and we're fortunate to have with us to talk about profiles or individuals who played a very, very significant role in the African American experience and some of the courage that they displayed in terms of the activities that they were involved in. And of course, Dr. Baldwin, let me welcome you to the show this morning.
Thank you.
And let me tell you, Dr. Baldwin, how delighted we are to have you here, and especially to deal with the topic that we're going to talk about this morning, because what we're trying to deal with this morning will be individuals who have played significant roles across the century in the African American history experience and some of the courageous things that they were involved in. And I would imagine, just thinking about individuals myself, that there were many who had to play a major role and they had to be very, very courageous because I think you're going back to slavery and et cetera. And certainly if you wanted to talk about those centuries, the individuals that you're going to highlight had to be very, very extraordinary and very, very informed individuals. And so let's start off by having you to simply open us up by talking about what you consider to be some of the individuals that met your idea of profile.
Well, I think we have to go back to the 18th century and perhaps further back, because in the 18th century you had a number of black Americans emerging as founders of institutions. You had Andrew Bryan, David George, George Lyell, who started the first black churches in the South. You had Richard Allen and Peter Spencer and James Varick and others who started the first black churches in the North. So when I talk about the earliest black profiles in courage, I have to go back to the 18th century and look at those African Americans who started the first black institutions. We're not only talking about churches, we're talking about free African societies, because these institutions were designed to what? Advance the liberation and empowerment of black Americans. And so when you talk about Andrew Bryan and Richard Allen and James Varick and others, they founded the very first black institutions under the shadow of slavery. There was a lot of slavery and persecution going on in those years, but they realized that if black people were to be autonomous on any level, if they were to have any control at all over their destiny, spiritual and otherwise, they had to what? Develop and maintain their own institution.
And it's important that these individuals be recognized, dealing with the profile and courage, recognizing that we're talking about a period where it was against the law to teach African Americans to read or write, and against the law to establish religious organizations, and to talk about somebody establishing a church for African Americans in slavery. It had to be an extraordinary individual, and so I think I understand exactly what you mean.
And quite a courageous act.
It had to be.
When Richard Allen, of course, walked out of St. George's Methodist Episcopal Church in Philadelphia, that was a courageous act.
It had to be.
When Andrew Bryan in Savannah, Georgia, was whipped because he started the first African Baptist church there. You're talking about profiles and courage in the 18th century. And their work, of course, extended over into the early 19th century when you have the rise of institutional black churches, Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian, Episcopal with Absalom Jones. All of these leaders were profiles in courage. And they actually started the institutions that would serve as the de facto platform for black liberation movement.
The abolitionist movement would have to come out of those churches. And it was against the law in all of the southern states for any African Americans to promote or to advocate liberation. As you said, and all of these individuals, many of these individuals were freedmen, but in many instances, freedmen were subject to the same kind of constraints that slaves were constrained with.
And many of them had come out of the institution of slavery. Richard Allen had been a slave in Delaware, and Andrew Bryan, a slave in Georgia. So you have to understand that they started these institutions under the shadow of the institution of slavery. And it was a courageous act because they understood and they suffered through reprisals, even the risk of limb and death.
Okay, well, so what we'll take our first commercial break and then we'll be back. We'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. Because to do what they did, you know, it's against law to talk about.
Huh? Oh, it's coming out? It looked like it was Oh, okay. Maybe I should.
Could you just stick it in your pocket? No, not up there. Just stick it in your pocket.
Okay.
Back in,
We just don't want it to fall down.
Okay. I want to make sure. Wait, hold up.
Or just put it in the seat behind you, Dr. Baldwin, if you can.
There you go. I don't think it'll fall down from there. No, I don't. Yeah. Is that all right? Is this supposed to be plugged into anything?
No.
Oh, okay. I think it's all right. I'll just hold on to it.
No, you can't hold on. No, to swing on around here with me like that. Not exactly on. Just put it in your seat. Right
in
behind,
my seat?
Right back in.
Is that all right?
Back there. Yeah,
that's good.
That'll hold it.
Okay.
Yeah, that'll hold it.
Okay.
You know, just I like that. Now come on back around here.
Is that all right? I hope so.
Okay. Okay. Now look at now. Okay. Okay. Don't swing that chair now. Okay. Thank you and welcome back to the second segment of the show for today. We're talking to Dr. Louis Baldwin, and the topic is Profiles in Courage of the African American Experience. And Dr. Baldwin, let's allow you to continue our discussion from the last segment dealing with individuals who were courageous in a real sense, and especially those individuals who were freedmen or individuals who were slaves, and I think as you indicated earlier, it was against the law
Exactly.
to teach a slave to read or write.
Exactly.
And those slaves who might become freedmen understood that the difficult problems that they had to face if they were going to talk about getting out and establishing a church and et cetera. Go on and deal with it.
Exactly. Now, I spoke of Richard Allen and Andrew Bryan, those early church founders, and they understood that if their people were going to be liberated and empowered, they had to own their own institutions. If they were going to be autonomous and have any control at all over their spiritual destiny, and their destiny in other senses, they had to own their own institutions. So they founded churches, and these churches in the 19th century became de facto platforms for the struggle against what? Slavery, against colonization, and for emancipation. In the 19th century, of course, you get people like Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth and Frederick Douglass, all of whom were profiles in courage because they used the black church as a kind of de facto platform to struggle against slavery, for abolitionism, against colonization, and to advance the cause of black people as it related not only to religion, but to education, the right to participate in the democracy through voting, etc. They fought for that. Black churches were schools. They were institutions that encouraged economic cooperation in the black community, economic self-sufficiency. So what you had in the 18th century, of course, was the movement to start these institutions in the 19th century to use these institutions as a kind of de facto platform for black liberation and empowerment. So when you get to the late 19th century, of course, these institutions are well placed, they are established. Late 19th century, there's an effort to establish black institutions throughout the South, i.e. churches, etc. And these institutions were designed to what? Represent black people and to be a social and political basis or power basis for the struggle for black liberation and empowerment.
And I also noticed, Dr. Baldwin, you mentioned a couple of females dealing with this, and to be an African-American female during this time, to talk about, well, go on and talk about some of those
Now,
courageous...
we often focus on Frederick Douglass in the 19th century, Henry Highland Garnett, Martin Delany. They were all great leaders, but you have to look also at Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman, both of whom were slaves at one time in their lives. Sojourner Truth, as you well know, became an important activist not only against slavery, but also for women's rights. She's famous for the phrase, "ain't I a woman?" because she was concerned not only about the liberation of slaves, she was concerned about the liberation and empowerment of women as well.
Very good.
And Harriet Tubman, who, as you well know, was a conductor on the Underground Railroad, who made it possible. She took 19 trips into the South, and some 300 slaves were liberated under her leadership.
Now that's courage.
Exactly.
That's courage for a female to be involved. It's one, as I think you indicated, it's one thing for Frederick Douglass to be an abolitionist, to talk about going into the South and dealing with slavery, but to think in terms of females and where females stood within that time. Category.
So you talk about James Forden, you talk about Frederick Douglass, but what about Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth? These women who combined an emphasis on women's liberation with a focus on abolitionism, emancipation, the liberation of black people from slavery. So you're talking about women in the 19th century, not simply Frederick Douglass and Henry Highland Garnett and others, but women who used the black church as a kind of de facto platform to fight not only for women's rights, but to fight for the liberation and empowerment of people of African descent.
And I think that one of the individuals that I've been impressed with has, and I'm sure you will mention her later on, since we're talking about women, Ida Wells Barnett.
And there you
See,
go.
because,
There you go.
hanging was talk about Ida.
Yes. Now, when you get all right, Doctor. You got it.
Let me see if I can get it back on. So we start at the second segment. This is that 8 minutes.
First segment, we talked about starting black churches
Okay.
in the African society. And secondly, how they use those institutions as a platform to empower and liberate their people.
Thank you and welcome back to the second segment of the show for today. We're talking to Dr. Lewis Baldwin, and he's given us some information dealing with profiles in courage in African American history. And of course, Dr. Baldwin, I think that during that first segment, it gave us an opportunity to talk about some of the courageous individuals dealing with the African American experience.
Yes.
And I think that during the second segment, let's see if we can talk about some of the females
Exactly.
involved, African American females involved in courageous experiences during this particular
Yes.
period.
Now, in the first segment, I talked about the founders of black churches like Richard Allen and Andrew Bryan and James Varick and Peter Spencer. All of these were males who were involved in the founding of black institutions, meaning, of course, free African societies and churches. Now, in the 19th century, early 19th century, you had women like Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman who used these institutions as a platform for their advocacy of black liberation
Very
and
good.
also of women's rights. If you look at Sojourner Truth, for an example, who was born in the late 18th century, she was very much an advocate for human rights, taking into account African American rights and women's rights. Harriet Tubman, who was a conductor on the Underground Railroad, who went into the South some 19 times and freed over 300 slaves. So you're talking about women who were active, and we don't often get a lot of focus on that. In using the black church as a power base and a social political base to free their people, and not only their people, but women.
And see, and that's the peculiar thing about it, because the very, very fact that they were females
Yeah.
in a period of slavery, and that they were black in the areas of, and then to think about some of the things that they were able to accomplish meant that they had to be courageous in terms of dealing with what
Exactly,
they had to do.
because when you talk about black women in the 19th century. You're talking about women who suffered on the basis of not only race and gender, but also class. You're talking about the triple evils that afflicted black women, and yet they became profiles in courage in terms of addressing the issues that not only confronted their own people, black people, but women, and the whole issue of human rights in general.
And they had to be courageous to do such things during this
Exactly. Now, unfortunately, the focus has been largely on people like Frederick Douglass and Henry Highland Garnett and Martin Delany and Alexander Cromwell, all of whom were great leaders. But I think part of the problem in the history books that we've written is that we've ignored the prominence of women, as profiles in courage.
And these certainly represented individuals who were courageous
Exactly.
during the period.
Exactly. And when you get to the late 19th century, you have people like Amanda Berry Smith and others who were active. Of course, in that period also, Ida B. Wells were born.
Oh, yes.
And Mary Cloud Bethune were born. So the 19th century was a rich period, not only for the involvement of black males in the struggle, but also females.
And struggle as well. Very good. And of course, looking back over this period, Dr. Baldwin, and pushing it further, we find that some of these individuals, male or female, were able to overcome all kinds of obstacles and able to move forward, even at a time when there was so much opposition in terms of them being able to do so.
Exactly. I mean, and when you speak of the 18th and early 19th century, you're talking about the challenge of slavery and colonization and these other problems that black people had to front. In the late 19th century, it's Reconstruction and how to respond to that in terms of what? You know, bringing the struggle for black liberation to a new level.
Very good.
In the late 19th century and in the early 20th century, with the rise of people like Ida B. Wells and Mary McLeod Bethune and Reverdy C. Ransom and W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, you have that continuing struggle to empower black people, to liberate black people, and it too is rooted in the church as a power base. So there's this struggle that has historic continuity. There's an unbroken history here from the time that Andrew Bryan and Richard Allen started these black churches through the period when Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth used these churches as a de facto platform in the struggle, up to the time of Ida B. Wells, Booker T. Washington, Reverend Ransom, and others who continued to use the black church as a kind of social and political base in their struggle for what? Social justice, equality of opportunity, and peace.
And I think especially of Ida B. Wells, the activities that she undertook against lynching.
Exactly.
Now, say something about the evils of lynchings during this period.
Yes, now lynchings occurred beginning in the period after the Civil War when blacks first got the right to vote in the South. There was a kind of white backlash, as you well know, that included lynchings and the slaughter of black people. In the early part of the 20th century, you had the rise of the Klan in the late 19th century also. In the early part of the 20th century, you had the revival of the Klan. So what happens here is that in the context of a culture and American life where there were lynchings, etc., people like Ida B. Wells became a crusader against lynchings. And W.E.B. Du Bois and Reverdy C. Ransom and others who emerged during that period, they were very, very concerned about what? How the lack of value attached to black lives. Not only that, but also the fact that black people couldn't vote in many parts of the country. They didn't have the right to participate in politics as whites did during those periods. So it was very, very important for them to continue to go to the church and to use it as a kind of power base in the struggle for justice.
And it's important that we recognize males as
And
well
females.
as females in terms of the overall struggle in terms of fighting for African American rights.
Right, and I think we don't realize that the early part of the 20th century was a very challenging time in the history of Black America. And when Ida B. Wells took on this crusade against lynchings, it was very important. It was courageous on her part.
And of course, Dr. Baldwin, we're going to have to call it quits for today. And we'll be back with see our audience again next week for another informative edition of Comments. Thank you and good morning. We ended that too fast. I thought we were ending the. Oh yeah, okay. And so he's fixing up us for the third segment. Okay, we got this last 10 minutes. Yeah. Okay, well we got 10 minutes to deal with that. Yeah, I didn't know. I thought you were closing me out. Yeah, but I thought you were ending it rather than ending the segment. Thank you and welcome back to the final segment of the show for today. We're talking to Dr. Lewis Baldwin, and he's given us some information in reference to courageous African Americans throughout the centuries. And of course, Dr. Baldwin, let's start this final segment dealing with some of those individuals that we've talked about during the first and second segment and some of the roles that they played, and go on and push it further within the centuries.
Okay, we've dealt in the 18th century with figures like Richard Allen and Andrew Bryan. We've dealt with figures like that in the 18th century. James Varick and others. In the 19th century, we've talked about Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth, Frederick Douglass. Now, in the early 20th century, Ida B. Wells and Mary McLeod Bethune and Reverdy C. Ransom, W.E.B. Du Bois. But when you get to the late 20th century, of course, Martin Luther King Jr., you have to take into account leaders like Diane Nash Bevel, who was important, Ella Baker, who were important in the civil rights movement. And they too were building on that tradition that had started with Andrew Bryan and Richard Allen and Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman and Richard Allen. In fighting for the civil rights of African Americans. And of course, we see today leaders building on that tradition. People like Alicia Garza, people like Patrice Cullors, who are involved with the Black
Lives Matter
movement. They are actually building on a long tradition of struggle. And they are young female activists. And it's quite interesting because if you look at the leadership patterns in the history of this country, you note that in the 1950s and 60s, we had leaders in their 20s and 30s. Martin Luther King Jr., Ralph Abernathy, Andrew Young. And for the first time in our history today, we're seeing young Black leaders in their 20s and 30s. Like Alicia Garza and others, Oprah Tomeli, and others who are involved with the Black Lives Matter movement. So I think that shows a movement that has historic continuity, a movement that is unfolding over time, and a movement that will continue in terms of this goal of bringing about the realization of the liberation and empowerment of black Americans.
And you know, I can't get over the significance of African American females in the Black Lives Matter movement.
Exactly.
I think, and they too, I think, follow the same. It was as dangerous for Ida Wells Barnett to become involved in lynching as it is for young females today to become involved in the Black Lives movement.
Matter movement with issues of police brutality, racial profiling, the incarceration rates among black and brown. It's just as dangerous. Just as risky, because you're talking about young African American females today in the Black Lives Matter movement who are willing to risk limb and life to address these issues as they confront black people. Police brutality, racial profiling, injustice in the criminal justice system, incarceration rates. They are willing to take the same risks that people like Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman and Andrew Bryan, Richard Allen, all of these leaders took back in the late 18th and the 19th century.
You know, Dr. Baldwin, just listening at the names that you're dealing with now, many folks don't remember many of the names that you're bringing back into life in a real sense, and the roles that they played. And I think that to deal with courage now, we're talking not only about men, but we're talking about women who were as courageous and who put as much on the line. As a matter of fact, it might have been safer to be a man during this period.
It was safer to be a man
than to be a
because
woman.
they didn't have to deal with the issues of sexism and the patriarchal structures that confronted black women. So it was a little easier to be men
and be courageous than to be a woman.
In that particular period. Now the problem today, I think, is that even though you have the leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement, some blacks involved in the Me Too movement, we are seeing the rise of youth activism in the wake of the shooting in Florida. But it seems to me that in the future, the trend is toward not only female activism, but youth activism. And I see that occurring today, not only in the larger culture, but it's occurring in the black
community as well. Very good. And so in a real sense, if you look back over all of this history, that African Americans have a lot to be thankful for during this period that we celebrate as African American History Month. That they are as important in a real sense as the males doing this effort to bring
and that is important,
justice.
Very important, is taking into account the struggle of a whole people, male and female, but also understanding that the civil rights struggle in this country didn't start with Martin Luther King Jr. It's a movement that goes back to the 18th century and even further, with people like Richard Allen and Andrew Bryan, that extended through the 19th century with people like Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, through the 20th century with people like Ida B. Wells and Reverdy Ransom, W.E.B. Du Bois, Martin Luther King Jr., and up to the present with figures like Alicia Garza and Opa Tometi and others who are involved in the Black Lives Matter movement. So we're talking about a movement that has an unbroken tradition, that has historic continuity. And that's very, very important.
It is.
In the study of black history.
And it's important in terms of the contributions that Africans have made to the United States of America, the country itself.
Exactly.
See, and I don't think that those contributions can be diminished in any way. And I think the way you're bringing them out now and reminding us in a continuous fashion of the roles that Africans have played in American history. I think that's an important thing.
That's what Black History Month is all about, what we are celebrating now. And we can't celebrate Black History Month without realizing that there's this ongoing burst of struggle, of creativity in the context of struggle, led by black people who in many ways have been the vanguard of the struggle for human liberation and empowerment in this society.
And you know, Dr. Baldwin, this says to me that with this kind of historical background and this kind of courage and activism, that we ought to be able to solve some of the major problems that we have today.
Yeah.
Dealing with youth unemployment, dealing with youth violence. I mean, here today we have a situation that requires some kind of courage. When you talk about
exactly.
the number of black...
And I think part of that involves looking back on the figures that I talked about today who were concerned about the same issues. We can look back to them for inspiration.
Good.
Because Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, James Varick, all of these leaders, Andrew Bryan, all from the 18th and 19th century, Ida B. Wells, they were all talking about the dignity and worth of all human personality, the dignity and the sacredness of black life.
Good.
So as we deal with these issues of black on black violence, as we deal with these issues of violence in our schools, as we deal with these issues of poverty and the threat of nuclear war and other issues in our community, sexism, homophobia, Islamophobia, as we deal with all of these issues, we should look back, I think, on these figures and what we can learn from them, and the kind of inspiration that we can get from them, while also coming up with our own ideas and our own solutions to these problems.
Very good. And Dr. Ball, let me thank you during this last few seconds for the information and the continuity that you've brought to us and the names that you've used in terms of individuals who play such important roles. And of course, let me encourage our audience to tune in again next week for another informative edition of Comments. Thank you and good morning.